Hello, everyone. I want to give you a little slice of how we build up the expenditure side. Sometimes we call it the demand side, but really I think it's better the expenditure side of GDP. And what we're going to do is we're going to briefly review the identity, the national income accounting identity that you're probably familiar with. Then we're going to be looking a little bit more closely at some of the behavioral elements. And then finally, we're going to be looking at how we actually implement these behavioral elements in the spreadsheet for your country. So, just to remind you that the total of what we produce in equilibrium must equal to the total of all expenditures. That includes expenditures by households. We call that consumption, household consumer expenditures. Then I is investment expenditures largely by firms. We can also include residential by households, but for the most part, this is firms. We can talk about government, which we will be covering in the fiscal sector, and this is going to be government spending on consumption and government spending on exports. I'm sorry, on investment, government consumption, government investment. Then we have the foreign sector here, so we have everything that we sell to our trading partners. We call those exports, minus everything that we purchase from our trading partners, which is imports. So as you remember, that if let's say that one of the elements of investment includes inventories, so that if, let's say, for example, the sum of expenditures, the consumption, government, exports, net of imports, does not equal, let's say that it's less than what we produce in a given period, then we build up inventories, and that is sort of the equalizing account. Now, okay, it turns out we'll be discussing this more deeply in the course. Okay, we would want to think about some very just sort of generic behavioral relationships, and I want to point those out to you. Looking first at consumption, perhaps the major element that we want to think about is, as a determinant of consumption, is disposable income, which of course is GDP minus taxes. Okay, that's disposable income. And as you probably already knew, that typically when households have more, just one second here. Just continuing, as households have more income that is available to them to spend, typically they will spend some more of that in terms of their consumer expenditures. Now you'll notice here that we do not have an interest rate in here, but we could also put in an interest rate, and many people do. So the idea is when the interest rate rises, it's more costly to consume. That's what we call a substitution effect, that households will economize on current consumption and enjoy the benefits of interest rates. Moving next to the investment expenditures, things look very, very similar here. We're going to okay, let's focus first on the cost of capital, which all else equal is going to be reflected in the real lending rate in the economy. And the real lending rate is going to be equal to the nominal and lending rate minus inflation. But the lending rate itself we're going to be assuming is equal to the monetary policy rate plus some spread. So the idea is that the monetary policy rate is very short term and it's very sure, whereas loans to private firms tend to be of a little bit longer duration and also a little bit riskier. So we'll see that the lending rate is very important here. When the lending rate goes up, firms tend to reduce in their investment expenditures. At the same time, we're also putting in output. We think of that as an accelerator. The idea is that when output increases, profitability for firms increase, and they'll have to ramp up their investment expenditures in order that the capital stock that they have on hand is sufficient to meet the demands of new higher GDP. So that's why this most investment functions will include GDP, an accelerator, as well as the interest rate. We're going to be assuming that government is exogenous. It's fiscal. We'll be looking at fiscal policy, and once again, I do want to remember we have to be thinking of both government consumption and government investment. We'll be getting into that in another section, and then finally, when we think of exports, it's very tempting to think about the real exchange rate, and that's okay, except that we're going to be looking at things a little bit more precisely. We're going to be looking at real exchange rates that are specifically relevant for exporters and imports, and we'll be calling those the relative price of exports and the relative price of imports, and we'll be looking at those, and we'll be assuming that all else equal, it's the relative price of exports. When exports become more expensive or more pricey relative to other goods in the economy, that's going to encourage domestic entrepreneurs to ramp up their export production and focus more of their resources. And then when we talk about imports, precisely the reverse. When imports become more expensive relative to domestic goods, that we'll see a cutback there. But also we'll see this idea that when GDP rises, that means that people have more money to spend and they'll be spending more on imports. Okay? So now what we're going to do is we're going to look more deeply exactly at the precise functional form. And as you can see here, okay, we're going to be looking actually sort of really, we'll find out that this is going to be in first differences of percentage changes. So we want to think of these as logarithms. But in any event, the change in consumption is going to be equal to a function of the change in disposable income multiplied by some coefficient. And that is in some sense our marginal propensity to consume, but also we're going to include a lagged effect here. In a sense, if we were consuming a lot in the previous period, there's going to be some carryover or some momentum into this current period, and we want to be able to capture that. And then finally, we want to be looking at interest rates. This is typically going to be negative. Why is that? Because typically if interest rates go up, the cost for households to get loans go up, and they may cut back on their plans a little bit. It's not going to be typically a very strong effect. And we're going to see that actually when it comes to estimating for our current year, and we left off the year here, this is going to be 2020, we'll actually be implementing this equation, and we'll be using these coefficients. So you can see that our beta 1 here is, that's our coefficient for disposable income, and it's 0.7, which means that if GDP goes up, or disposable income goes up by 1%, consumption will go up by 0.7%. We can see also that there's a kind of a carryover from the previous period, and that elasticity is 0.3. So if we had higher, 1% higher consumption growth in the previous period, that's going to push up current consumption growth, not by 1%, by 0.3 times 1%, a third of a percent. And then finally, we can look at the real interest rate here. And this says that if we have let's say a 100 basis point increase in the real interest rate, households will cut back on their consumption not by 1%, but by a third of a percent, 0.3 of a percent. And that's our assumption. Now, we also mentioned that we don't want to be straitjacketed by these equations, because sometimes we believe that there are going to be other factors. For example, consumer confidence, for example, past debt, for example, just fears or exuberance, and we're going to want to add that in to our forecast. Here we have an add factor of minus 0.1%, which means that we believe that consumption is going to be even a little lower than our equation would have told us to be. Why? Once again, it's because we know some other stuff. Now let's turn next to investment, and you can see that we also have the change in investment. And the way that we formulated the accelerator here, it looks as it's the change in income relative to the previous period. So if income is ramping up, income growth is ramping up, that means we have a higher investment, but also it turns out that we have potential output. That's what the star is. So if potential output is rising, then we're also going to have higher investment, because we'll have capital requirements in order to produce that investment. And finally, our real interest rate factor, once again, as I mentioned, that's going to be negative. So we'll be implementing that, and you can see that we've implemented that right here. We've assumed there's a 1%, there's an elasticity of 1 on GDP acceleration. There's also an elasticity of 1 assumed with potential GDP. And then the real interest rate factor is going to be minus 0.5, which you can see that's bigger than what we had assumed for consumption, because we assume that most of the time when interest rates rise, it's investment much more than consumption that takes the hit. And then also we have an add factor here. In this case, the add factor is positive. It's 3.8%. We'll leave it to you, or we can discuss this number, but the meaning of this number would be that, once again, we believe that there may be some investment projects that are coming along the line that we know about that are independent of what we find in the equation, or we may be reading some signals. For example, business confidence may be extraordinarily high. So then what we're going to do, I want to mention one more thing though, is that let's go back to this this important equation here. If I haven't lost it, here we go. You can see now that both consumption is a function of Y and investment is a function of Y. That the idea that this is YD, so when output increases, disposable income increases, and also that we have our accelerator effects. So you can see that we have Y here on both the right-hand side and the left-hand side. We want to make sure that we're talking about the very, very same value of GDP on both the left and right-hand side, and we have a way to reconcile that, but we'll do that in another video. Instead, what I'm going to do here, I'm going to take us right here to the spreadsheet, and okay, so you can see here. So in this case, we can let's see, we can trace some precedents here. Okay, so you can see here that this is that this cell here, this is H16, is simply the reflection of these coefficients here, plus the add factor. And these other factors here. So let's see if we can replicate this. So in the first case, we have this times the change in disposable income, and it turns out that the change in disposable income should be somewhere down here. Let's see, disposable income percentage change right here. So that's our first element, okay? And that's actually probably our biggest element right there. But it turns out that that's not the end of the story, because we also have to have we have to add on 0.3 times the growth of the lag growth of consumption. So since we're projecting 2020, we have to take lag consumption as 2019, and then the third thing that we have to have is that we have to have 0.3 times. And then I believe that what we're going to do is we're going to take the real interest rate here and average lending rate. So here we go, change in the average effective lending rate. So you can see here that this is, we made several calculations. First we calculated that we took note of the nominal lending rate, and then we took an effective lending rate, which we'll discuss that concept later on, and then we turn this from a nominal interest rate to a real interest rate, and then you can see that the change here is that because of higher inflation, that real interest rate has gone down from 4.5 to 1.2. That's a change of 3.3. So we're going to multiply that 0.3, and then finally we're going to put in the add factor here. Let's go back upstairs, plus our add factor here, and well, we've missed something here. Let's see what we have here. And well, it turns out we made a little mistake here because we were using the lagged predictive value. So let's change that. Let's bring that up here to the lagged actual value, the 5.9%, and you can see that's how we get our 6.4%. So that's exactly what we have in here. So once again, we have shown you how we have gotten a prediction of consumption growth. And then I have to mention here that the level of consumption, how do we get to the level of consumption? We just take last periods times 1 plus the consumption growth here. So this number here is 6.4% higher than the previous year, according to our equation. Just to mention, without going through, I'm going to leave it to you guys to replicate this number here for investment to see how we got this 3.8 here, and then just to mention once again that the important thing here is that there is going to be feedback between consumption and GDP, because on the one hand, consumption is determined by GDP, investment is determined by GDP, but on the other hand, GDP itself is the sum of consumption plus investment plus some other things. So this is how we get the two elements of domestic private expenditures. Thank you very much.